Before we start today's episode, I want to make a clarification from last week's episode. On last week's episode segment, Allow Me to Explain, I forgot to mention the connection between the Warner Discovery merger to the previous episode, which I discussed in full detail about mergers, so I thought I would get that out of the way for clarification purposes. On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, it's a double feature. My film reviews are 1 week and The Cameraman, followed by my segment, Allow Me to Explain, and it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review, or reviews. My film review, or reviews for this episode, is a Buster Keaton double feature, 1 week and The Cameraman. 1 week was released in 1920 and directed by Edward F. Klein and Buster Keaton, starring Buster Keaton and Sybil Seeley. The Cameraman was released in 1928, directed by Edward Sedgwick with uncredited work by Buster Keaton, starring Buster Keaton and Marceline Day. I managed to see this double feature with my best friend Paige at the Tampa Theater as part of the last day of the Summer Movie Classics on August 28th. It was an enjoyable experience to watch these features with the Wurlitzer organ playing as the main score by Dr. Stephen Ball. They were both films that I longed to see, and now I had seen both these American classics. It was a joy to see this double feature thanks to a friend of the family. If you had been with me to the Tampa Theater to watch this double feature, you would have seen how many people actually came to show up for these films. There were at least more than 100 people inside the theater. I remember seeing a couples coming to the theater, the man wearing a pork pie hat and suit, the woman wearing a flapper hat and dress. The other members of the audience were dressed in casual clothing. Some were with their friends, others brought their kids to watch the double feature. There were members of the audience taking pictures of the Wurlitzer organ or taking pictures of themselves right at the front of the theater before the main features began. My friend and I also took pictures as well. Once the feature began, the audience was reacting to some of the funniest gags on the screen as well as the comic antics throughout the story. The story for 1 week is about a newlywed couple, played by Buster Keaton and Sybil Seeley, who are moving into their new house, thanks to the groom's uncle who bought a lot and the parts needed to build their new house. However, once the couple starts building their new home, the rival, Handy Hank, ends up misnumbering the parts to construct their own house so that their own home looks like it's out of place. Next thing you know, the house starts to look like a carnival attraction with all sorts of crazy things going on in their new home. The short film felt very timely, and it looked as though the film had never aged for more than 100 years after its release. I had a great time enjoying this film with Paige right next to me. Every gag, no matter how dangerous it looked, was perfect. Starting with the groom moving from one car to another with his bride and the driver, then to the construction of the house with the necessary parts to build it in just 1 week. The stunt work and the amount of risk that Keaton took when he performed every gag in this picture looked both grueling and frightening when he performed them on screen. The gags involving the construction of the couple's house varied from silly to dangerous. There was a moment when Keaton was working on one side of the house with him and his leading lady, Sybil Seeley, pivoting in a seesaw motion, with Sybil on the second floor and Keaton on the ground, and the moment that Sybil tries to get down, the entire side of the house falls with the empty window frames landing right where Keaton was on cue. It was a dangerous stunt that Keaton stated that almost killed him during the filming of this short that he would later perfect in his 1928 feature, Steamboat Bill Jr. Some of the best gags in the film involved the house itself. The gag involving bringing the piano inside the house, causing the floor in the room on the second floor to serve as a spring, which caused Handy Hank to jump to the roof of the house and having his head stuck to the roof, and Keaton having to figure out how to get his head out of the roof until he accidentally hits him with a pipe valve. Or the moment when Keaton was supposed to put the chimney top to the hole of the house that is connected to the bathroom, and he ends up falling into the bathroom with his wife taking a shower, and he ends up running out of the bathroom to the door that is connected to nowhere, or when the family comes over to the house on a stormy day, since the roof has holes and there is nothing holding the house at the bottom, as the wind starts spinning, the house becomes a carnival ride, like a merry-go-round, and Keaton has to start running towards the front door of the house, and he ends up missing the door no matter how many times he tries to get in. The idea for this short film started when Keaton saw a documentary titled Homemade from Ford Motor Company from 1919. The documentary explored the concept of the prefab homes that would later reach a zenith peak in the 1920s decade. Keaton would use this concept as a parody for his short film by using the narrative concept of having the action take place in 7 days of the week. Some of the gags that were very complex to perform on camera during the filming of this short involved the house itself serving as a giant contraption for Keaton to be innovative and creative with his own jokes. During the storm sequence, the house was attached to a giant turntable, giving it the illusion that the house, without any support from the ground, was spinning so rapidly on its axis, along with the family members inside also spinning, as if one was going to pass out. Another gag that is so brilliant in this film is when Sybil Seeley is in the bathtub taking a bath, and just as she was about to pick up the soap off the ground, she looks straight at the camera, and suddenly the movie is now self-aware by having the hand from off-camera cover the lens, since the audience is omnipresent. Keaton's direction in this film is purely original. Every stunt work that he poured out in this film, along with every gag that he exhibited, was phenomenally ingenious. He knew how to make the gag work, even if the film today is more than 100 years old. He knew how to innovate each and every gag and joke in this picture, since this was his first short one-reeler without Fatty Arbuckle, who taught him everything that he needed to know about making films with a dose of physical comedy. He also was an innovator and magician who knew how to make the audience laugh with every trick up his sleeve, from using the gags after the couple was married and Keaton having to stretch out both his legs as he is between two cars, to the moments with the construction of the house itself. He was a comedic master in physical comedy with his deadpan expression. This short one-reeler, which is about 15-20 minutes long, made its debut on September 1st, 1920. It was his first independent release and was one of the top grossing releases of 1920 that year. The critical reception of this film was mostly positive, and it would make a mark into Keaton's career for his producer Joseph M. Schenck of Metro Pictures before it would be merged as MGM in 1924. The film would later be added to the National Film Registry from the Library of Congress in 2008 and was restored in 2015 through Lobster Films, according to IMDb. I enjoyed watching this film, and I thought that it felt so timely and innovative that without Keaton's creative contributions, I wouldn't see physical comedy last this long in this short feature. The synopsis for the film The Cameraman is about a tintype photographer named Buster, played by Buster Keaton, who one day is taking a tintype photograph of a random passerby when a gaggle of newsreel cameramen and a huge crowd gathering for an event end up disrupting Buster's business with confetti, streamers, and paper lying all over the ground, and also by making it feel claustrophobic in the crowd. And he later sees Sally, a secretary who works at the newsreel's office at MGM, and he decides to take her picture. Then Buster follows her, and he follows her straight to the MGM newsreel office. Buster then decides that since he is a photographer, that he would work for the studio at their newsreel office, but the only way that he could make it in the newsreel working place is to buy his own camera. Since he could not afford the latest newsreel cameras because of their price, he ends up pawning his tintype camera with a used and dilapidated camera from the pawn shop for $140, and he tries to catch whatever story that he is trying to cover to make it in the business. And he was not very lucky, since he was unable to capture whatever story he wants to put for his resume. He misses. But later in the story, he has grown fondly in love with Sally, and he wants to be with her. I would not lie if I was saying that this is an underrated film of Keaton's career that would sadly be marred by his time at MGM. The film itself, if you watched it from beginning to end, was a deconstruction about the movie-making business and the power of the camera as the observer. That would now become common with the emergence of cameras on iPhones recording events that start out as local and innocent to harrowing and graphic about the state of what is going on in our own backyard and across the globe. Well, I felt that Keaton's character was sympathetic throughout the entire film because I, as a member of the audience, want to see him succeed at getting into the business and making a name for himself. no matter how many times he tries to make something important and engaging. It is something that I would feel as entirely relatable to anyone who has missed a huge event that they want to be a part of. Some of the best gags as I was watching the film with my best friend Paige involved the repetitive gag of Keaton holding up a camera and breaking the window for the MGM newsreel office door at least, I would say, 4 or 5 times, maybe even more. Another gag that was enjoyable to watch is when Keaton goes to the dressing room in the swimming pool house with a large man as they undress to wear their bathing suits. Another great gag involved Keaton pretending that he is playing with all the players who are invisible at an empty baseball field when he is trying to capture a sports story that never came. The climactic moments in the film are when Keaton is trying to shoot a riot in Chinatown and being creative with his own camera angle and shot to capture the event, and the drowning of Sally from an out-of-control boat that ends up exploding, and Buster having to save her life, only to let the other character claim that he had saved her. The production of this film was actually very bumpy than his previous films. This was his first studio picture that he made with MGM. The studio gave him a salary for his contract of $3,000 a week. Once he signed the contract, Keaton would later describe this decision years later as the worst mistake of my career. He originally sent Irving Thalberg a Western comedy script, which Thalberg later rejected. It was the studio's idea of a newsreel cameraman that led to the making of this film, since it suited Keaton's strengths to play around with cinematic devices that he had experimented before, such as reverse motion and the use of double exposure. But for Keaton working at one of the biggest studios in Hollywood, and the most conservative studio in Hollywood, it proved to be a mismatch since MGM was not known to be friendly to its comedians and their use of improv. He also had less creative control since most of the gags and the story process were done by 23 writers in the story room. He was no longer allowed to improvise his own gags or do the dangerous stunt work that he was used to doing independently, as well as the fact that years afterwards, Keaton felt that Thalberg appreciated his physical comedy, but he did not understand his creative process. While the film's directorial credit goes to Edward Sedgwick throughout the filming of this feature, half of it was directed by Buster Keaton, who was uncredited. While Sedgwick was a product of the studio system who had no style or trademarks throughout the picture except that he had to deliver a product that was on time and under budget, I felt and somewhat noticed that Keaton's presence as the director in the later half of the picture was all his, and he managed to make it through as both the actor and the director. The film premiered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on September 10, 1928, and later nationwide on September 22nd that same year. The film received mixed to positive reviews when it premiered in theaters. The film grossed to nearly $800,000 at the box office, and Keaton considered this to be one of his best films. The film was inducted to the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress in 2005. I truly think that this was Keaton's last innovative and creative films, even though this was his first studio film that I think did more damage to him in the creative process and ended up hurting his chances for a successful career that sadly ended up rendering him as a has-been. To those who would want to get a full look into Buster Keaton's entire life story, there is a wonderful documentary that includes both of these films entitled The Great Buster, A Celebration, from 2018, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, whom we sadly lost this year. It is, in my opinion, the only good biographical documentary about Buster Keaton that I think covers more of his life story than any of the other documentaries that were covered in years past. Keaton knew how to make the audience laugh, and the audience that I was with at the Tampa Theater would definitely agree, even though in The Cameraman, it seems obvious that the capuchin monkey would somehow steal the show in the latter half of the film, but it still manages to work. These are both comical pieces of entertainment that I highly recommend to watch, as well as giving it another shot for those who have never seen silent comedies. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. With the midterm elections nearly 3 months away, the dangerous rise of misinformation is sure to be rampant for this year, but there are already looming dangers of misinformation within the Latino-Latinx community and what can be done to prevent this issue. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. The spread of misinformation is so common on social media networks like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, it is now targeting minority communities who are starting to believe in this barrage of misinformation without any fact-checking. One example of this is the Latino-Latinx community. Since the 2016 and 2020 elections, misinformation within the Latino-Latinx community has started to metastasize more recently with the disinformation on news regarding abortion after the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe v. Wade. According to a Nielsen report from 2021, quote, misinformation poses a threat to Hispanics who are particularly vulnerable due to a greater reliance on social media and messaging platforms. Latinos are avid users of these apps because of the trust and intimacy they offer and their unique role within the community to connect people to family and friends both in the US and abroad. The outsized use of this technology also makes these apps prime for spreading misinformation, particularly among Latino communities. Much of the content, both user-generated and shared, is in Spanish, Spanglish, or colloquial Spanish, challenging conventional fact-checking and content moderation to keep up, end quote. The statistics for the use of the social media apps and platforms among Hispanics aged 18 to 34 are 69% for Instagram, 65% for Facebook Messenger, 50% for Snapchat, 47% for WhatsApp Messenger, 30% for Twitter, 18% for Discord, and 14% for Telegram Messenger. And where the information is shared and received amongst the Latino-Latinx community on a news website that is ripe with misinformation is 28% without any filtering or fact-checking on these websites. When it comes to new citizens or voters who are disproportionately Latino-Latinx, they face special risks in encountering misinformation from information gaps. New Latino voters would have a difficult time recognizing misinformation around new voting law changes in their state that would come from Spanish-speaking radio stations or websites where they get this information. One of the posing risks for misinformation being spread on social media platforms is that while the misinformation for English language misinformation is taken down, the identical story that is in Spanish has not and remains online. YouTube has played a role in courting Latino-Latinx members of the community to support former President Donald Trump through careful targeting practices, with the videos coming from Latin America riddled with misinformation. Stephanie Valencia, co-founder of Equus Labs, told Axios of the rise in misinformation and the lack of action from the platforms, quote, "The platforms have not been transparent about the resources that they're committing to address the challenge of Spanish language disinformation," unquote. She also stated to Axios that the Spanish misinformation on these platforms ranged from COVID-19 and false claims of President Biden endorsing socialism, and that some of the misinformation appeared to come from foreign nations like Colombia. So the question is that with misinformation rampant in Spanish language radio stations and websites and also on social media platforms and apps, without them being left unchecked, it could be a problem that would leave a vulnerable opening that could have devastating consequences on one's health, safety, and the difficulty of separating fact from fiction. A poll from last year by the Latino Anti-Disinformation Lab run by Voto Latino and Media Matters found that 53% of Latinos received harmful info about the COVID-19 vaccine on Facebook and 44% on messaging apps. What can be done about the situation facing a Latino-Latinx community at this moment, even if it is a short-term goal? Telemundo this year, along with their partnership with Pointer and MediaWise, launched an initiative to identify misinformation sent through WhatsApp as a crash course. Bold PAC, which is part of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, has put out a YouTube series to help correct misinformation amongst Latino voters called Ya Tú Sabes. The series is hosted by Gabriela Fresquez, and it is available to watch on YouTube so that you can share with your relatives or friends about this show and what it can do to help differentiate between fact from fiction. I highly recommend this show because it will help alleviate the concerns, or if you go to MediaWise in Espanol by going to https://www.pointer.org/verifica/. Bullpack is tracking misinformation that are found on conservative radio and TV in the battleground states and launched a bilingual social media initiative last fall to give Latino candidates and members of Congress to call out and correct misinformation, according to Axios. I am hopeful that whatever happens during this midterm election, that something good happens, since social media platform companies have not stepped up to do something regarding the amount of misinformation found on their platforms and are not taking them down or fact-checking it. And if there is one thing or anything that I want to see, It is that I hope that these social media tech companies will heed this call. If not, then we will be doomed to repeat history again at our own expense. This has been Allow Me to Explain. The information for the Allow Me to Explain segment on misinformation in the Latino-Latinx community came from Axios, NBC News, and Nielsen. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday. It is also on my blog website, filmtalkwithjordanramirez.wordpress.com, with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to any of my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.